The Integration Framework's cultural exchange program had been running for 11 years, which meant it had produced 11 cohorts of Vaelith and Terran young adults who had completed the 2-week residential curriculum and who had gone back to their respective institutions with the cross-cultural competencies the program was designed to produce. The program's efficacy reports, which were filed annually and which the Joint Authorities Education Division used to assess the program's continued funding, consistently rated the program as producing measurable improvements in cross-cultural communication competency among participants, which was the metric the efficacy reports used, and which was accurate, and which was not the whole of what the program produced, because the whole of what a residential program produced was not measurable in the single metric of the metric it reported against. Vaelith had read the efficacy reports before attending, because she read the documentation for everything she attended, and she had noted the efficacy metric, and had formed the assessment that a 2-week residential program was likely to produce the measurable improvement the metric described, and was unlikely to produce anything the metric didn't describe, which was the assessment of someone who understood what programs were designed to produce, and who expected programs to produce what they were designed to produce. She had been forming that kind of assessment since she was 12. The court's preparation curriculum had a specific structure that produced, across its 12-year arc, a particular kind of intelligence. The intelligence of someone who had been taught to read situations accurately and to understand the social and political forces operating in them, and to navigate those forces with the competency of someone who understood them rather than reacted to them. It was a genuinely useful intelligence. It was also, in the specific way of intelligences that were developed through systematic training rather than through encounter, an intelligence that was very good at the situations it had been trained for, and that had a specific gap in the situations it hadn't, which was the situations where the social and political forces were not the relevant forces, and where the accurate reading of the situation required a different kind of attention. She did not know she had this gap. She was 19 and had been inside the preparations framework for 12 years, which meant she had been inside the assumption that the preparation was comprehensive for 12 years, and comprehensive assumptions were not, from the inside, visible as assumptions. The program's residential facility was a joint authority building in the neutral zone between the capital's Vaelith administrative district and its Terran residential district. Specifically located, the program's materials said, to be in neither cultural home territory and in the shared space between them. Vaelith had read this and found it a reasonable design choice that was slightly on the nose as a metaphor, and she had noted the observation and filed it in the category of accurate assessments she was not going to share because they served no function in the context. She arrived at the registration hour in the correct attire for a non-ceremonial joint authority program. Her preparations curriculum covered non-ceremonial register correctly, and registered with the program's administrative staff, and received her room assignment and the program's schedule and the participant list and the workshop materials. She read the workshop materials that evening. She went to sleep with the efficient schedule management of someone who understood that performing a function well required adequate rest, and who allocated her sleep as a function requirement rather than a preference. In the morning, the program began. The orientation seating chart was on the session room's table when the participants arrived, which was the program's standard practice for ensuring that the alphabetical adjacencies produced the cross-cultural contact. The program was designed to generate rather than the cultural clustering that unassigned seating typically produced. Vaelith found her name card and sat and looked at the adjacent name card, which said Cael Morn, and looked at the participant list's entry for Cael Morn, which said, Terran 20, academic participant from the Terran Institute of Cultural Studies, first residential program. She noted this and returned her attention to the workshop materials. He arrived at approximately 2 minutes before the session start time, which was the arrival time of someone who had found the session room with the specific efficiency of someone who had looked at the facility map, and was not going to be late, and was also not going to arrive early in a context where early arrival had no function. He found his name card and sat beside her, and looked at the workshop materials briefly, and then looked at the room with the quality she noticed first. The genuine curiosity of someone who was looking at what was actually there rather than at what they expected to find or at what impression they were making. He said, to the room in general rather than to her specifically, "This is a much better facility than the one the program's website described." She said, because the observation was accurate and she had made the same assessment. The website's photographs are from the facility's first year. It's been renovated twice since. He looked at her. He said, "You read the website's photographs carefully enough to know they're outdated." She said, "I reviewed the documentation." He said, "All of it," she said, "the relevant documentation." He said, "What made the facility photographs relevant?" She said, "Understanding the environment you're operating in is relevant." He looked at her with the look of someone who had heard something and was thinking about it rather than formulating a response to it. He said, "That makes sense. I just looked at the schedule and the workshop topics." She said, "The schedule and the workshop topics are the primary preparation, yes." He said, "You prepared more thoroughly than the primary preparation." She said, "It's a practice." He said, "Does it help?" "The thorough preparation for things you found are already handled." She considered this. It was a specific question and was not the question of someone who was challenging the practice. It was the question of someone who was genuinely curious whether the practice produced what it was designed to produce. She said, "It produces certainty about the baseline which frees attention for the things that deviate from it." He said, He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think I do a version of that but less systematically. I read the things that seem likely to be interesting and skip the things that seem likely to be what they say they are." She said, "And the facility photographs seemed likely to be what they said they were." He said, "Yes. And they were wrong." She said, "So your system produced a deviation you weren't prepared for." He said, "A very low-stakes deviation." She said, "Yes, in this case." He said, "Are deviations usually high stakes?" She said, "It varies by context." He said, "Your contexts are higher stakes than mine, I'm guessing." She said, "I don't know what your contexts are." He said, "Academic workshops mostly, some family dinners. The occasional situation where I've said something that turned out to be a much bigger deal than I realized it was." She said, "Those are the relevant deviations in academic workshops and family dinners." He said, "Yes. What are the relevant deviations in yours?" She looked at him. The question was the question of someone who was genuinely curious and who had asked it in the natural extension of the conversation, rather than as a directed inquiry into her life, which was what it technically was, and which was the kind of question that was asked to her routinely by people who were carefully managing their approach to asking it. He was not carefully managing anything. He was continuing the conversation. She said, "The relevant deviations in mine involve misreading someone's position in a negotiation or miscalibrating a social register in a diplomatic context." He said, "That sounds exhausting." She said, "It's the context." He said, "Sure, but exhausting." She said, "I don't think about it in those terms." He said, "What terms do you think about it in?" She said, "It's the function. The terms are the function's terms." He said, "That's." He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone searching for the diplomatic phrasing but in the way of someone thinking, "That's a very clean way to hold it. The function has terms and you operate in the function's terms." She said, "Yes." He said, "Does it ever feel like yours, the terms?" She said, "They're the context I operate in. The question of whether they feel like mine isn't the operational question." He said, "That's interesting." She said, "Is it?" He said, "Yes. Because the question of whether something feels like mine is usually the primary question for me. Whether I'm in the right context or the wrong one. Whether what I'm doing is the thing I'd be doing if I had the full choice." She said, "You ask yourself that?" He said, all the time. Do you? She said. The full choice isn't a frame I typically operate in. He said, because of the function. She said, yes. He said, and that doesn't bother you. She said, it's the context. He looked at her with the specific look of someone who had heard something and was not going to push on it, and was also not going to pretend he hadn't heard it. He said, okay. The orientation's facilitator called the session to order. Vaelith returned her attention to the session. She was also attending to something else, which was the quality of the last 8 minutes, which was a quality she did not have an immediate category for. The first disagreement happened in the second day's workshop on cultural value systems, which was the session that produced the most discussion in the program's history, according to the facilitator's notes. Because the subject was the kind of subject that people had genuine opinions about, and the residential program's context produced the genuine expression of genuine opinions, rather than the managed expression of managed ones. The session's discussion question was, does cultural value transmission across generations preserve what matters most or protect the interests of those doing the transmitting? Vaelith said, the distinction the question draws is false. The things that matter most to a culture are the things the culture's power structures have determined matter most, which means the transmission of those values is simultaneously the preservation of what matters most and the protection of the transmitting structure's interests. The two aren't separable. She said it with the accuracy of 12 years of preparation that had included extensive curriculum on cultural value systems, and with the specific quality of someone who had thought about this and had an actual position. Cael said beside her, I think that's a really good point, and I'd push back on the second half. The interests of the power structures and the interests of the people aren't always aligned, but the values sometimes survive the power structures that produced them. People keep caring about the value after the structure that transmitted it is gone, which suggests the value had something in it beyond the structure's interest. She said, that could be interpreted as evidence that the value was internalized successfully enough to survive the structure's removal. Successful transmission looks like genuine attachment, he said. It could also be evidence that genuine attachment produces the survival. How do you distinguish between the two from the outside? She said. You probably can't, he said. So the question is whether the attachment was always manufactured or sometimes real, and we can't answer it from the outside, which means we probably have to answer it from the inside, which is whether what I value feels manufactured or real. She said, feelings about whether something is genuine are not reliable evidence of its genuineness. He said, no, but they're the only evidence available from the inside, and we live from the inside. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes. That's a fair point, he said. The function's terms again. She looked at him. He said, living from the outside of the question because the inside evidence isn't reliable. That's a version of the function's terms. She said, I hadn't made that connection, he said. It just occurred to me. I might be wrong. She said, you might be. But it's interesting. He said, you said that before. She said, about what? He said, in the orientation. You said, does it ever feel like yours? And I said, all the time, do you? And you said, the full choice isn't a frame I typically operate in. And I said, and that doesn't bother you? And you said, it's the context. She said, you remember the orientation's conversation. He said, I tend to remember conversations that are interesting. She said, which conversations are interesting to you? He said, the ones where the person is saying what they actually think. She looked at him. She said, as opposed to, he said, as opposed to what they think they should say, or what they think will land well, or what they've said before and it worked. I can usually tell the difference, and the actual think ones are the ones I remember. She said, how can you tell the difference? He said, the actual think ones have a slight hesitation before the interesting part, not performance hesitation, the hesitation of actually working something out. You had it before the false distinction point. She said, I was formulating the position. He said, yes, that's what I mean. She was quiet. He said, I had it before the attachment point. Did you notice? She said, yes, I did, he said. So we were both actually thinking. That's why the conversation is interesting. She said, you assess conversations by whether both parties are actually thinking. He said, I assess them by whether I'm actually thinking and whether the other person seems to be. If both are yes, I want to stay in the conversation. If only one is yes, I want to finish the conversation. If neither is yes, I want to leave. She said, that's a clear metric. He said, it's the only one that seems to matter, she said. And diplomatic register, formal courtesy, the social function of exchange, he said, all fine, those are the container. The question is whether there's anything in the container, she said. Some containers are the point. He said, are they though? Or is it that the container's function is to make it possible for there to be something in it? And when the container is the point, the function has been mistaken for the thing. She looked at him for a longer moment than she had been looking at him in the previous conversations, which were conversations she had been attending to completely, and which she was now attending to with an additional quality that she was not yet categorizing. She said, that's a critique of the ceremonial context's value. He said, it's a question about whether ceremony is for something or is the thing. She said, most people in ceremonial contexts would say it's the thing. He said, most people in ceremonial contexts are inside them. We said the inside evidence isn't reliable. She said, you've connected two separate discussions. He said, the discussions are connected. You connected them first with the function's terms observation. She said, I made an observation. You built an argument from it. He said, that's collaboration. She said, yes. He said, was that a smile? She said, I was noting that your description of collaboration was accurate. He said, that was a smile. She said, the workshop is resuming. He said, yes. She returned her attention to the workshop. She was also attending to the smile, which had not been performed, and which had arrived without the usual interval of assessment that preceded her social expressions, which were typically calibrated to the context in the way of someone who had been trained to calibrate them. The smile had not been calibrated. It had simply been there. She noted this as a deviation from the expected pattern. She did not file it in the deviation's usual category, which was the category of things to understand so they could be managed. She filed it in a different category, which was a category she did not have a name for yet, and which she was not going to name prematurely. The week continued. The third day's extended meal conversation was about the program's workshop on institutional memory and how institutions preserved and distorted what they preserved. And Cael said that institutions were just people with longer memories, and she said that was a useful compression, but that the longer memory changed what the institution was in ways that made it distinct from the people who formed it. And they were in this for 40 minutes after the meal's official close, and the dining hall staff had begun the cleanup around them, and neither of them had noticed. The fourth day was the fieldwork session, which sent the program's participants into the neutral zone's public spaces to conduct the cultural observation exercise. And she and Cael were assigned to the same observation area because the assignments were alphabetical, and their names were adjacent, and the alphabetical adjacency had been producing this specific outcome since the first day. The fieldwork produced 2 hours of walking through the neutral zone's market district and taking observation notes and comparing observations. And the comparing was the part that was interesting because their observations were of the same things and were different in ways that were specific to what each of them was attending to, which was the most direct demonstration of the program's stated purpose that the program had produced, and they were both aware of this and said so. And the awareness and the saying were both in the register of two people who were genuinely in the exercise rather than performing it. He bought a food item from a market stall at the exercise's end and offered her half, and she ate half because it was offered directly, and accepting it was the natural response to a direct offer, and the natural response was what happened before the calibration intervened. The food was not something she had eaten before. It was good. She said it was good. He said he had eaten it twice before on his first time off his home system and had been thinking about it since. She said she understood the experience of something being better than you had the category to anticipate. He said, yes, exactly. The fifth day she asked him at the evening common room what he was studying. He said, cultural documentation. The preservation and transmission of cultural practices that are at risk of loss. The practical part of the work is field documentation, finding the communities and the practices and recording them before the recording is the only remaining form. She said, that's a specific application of the institutional memory question. He said, yes. I think institutions often don't know what they're preserving and what they're losing, because the thing that's being lost doesn't have an advocate because the people who held it are the ones leaving. So the documentation has to be done by someone who's coming toward the practice rather than leaving it. She said, an outside observer. He said, yes. Though the inside-outside thing gets complicated the longer you're in it. The documentation is better the closer you get, but the closeness changes the observer. She said, the observation changes what's being observed. He said, and what's doing the observing? Both. She said, what practices are you documenting? He said, currently. A Terran maritime community's navigational tradition that's maintained on 2 inhabited stations and has been declining since the 3rd station lost its population. The tradition requires 3 stations to complete the full cycle. It's still practiced, but it's partial now. She said, how do you document something that's lost apart? He said, you document the full tradition from the people who remember the full version, and you document the partial tradition as it's practiced now, and you document the gap between them, and you note in the documentation that the gap is the loss. The loss is part of the record, she said. That's a specific approach to incompleteness. He said, the incompleteness is real. Pretending it isn't produces a false record. A false record is worse than an incomplete one. She said, why? He said, because an incomplete record tells you what you know and what you don't. A false record tells you what you know incorrectly and you don't know to look for what's missing. She said, you find incompleteness preferable to falseness. He said, always. Don't you? She said, yes, I think I do. He said, you thought about that. She said, I was checking whether I actually believed it or whether I was agreeing because you stated it clearly. He said, and she said, I actually believe it. I've operated in contexts where the false record was the functional preference because the incomplete record's gap was more threatening than the inaccurate one, and I've found the false record's long-term cost higher than the gap would have been. He said, the function's terms preferred the false record. She said, in those instances. Yes, he said, but you didn't. She said, the assessment of cost is mine. Yes, he said, so you operated with the function's terms and assessed against them with your own standard. She said, yes. He said, that's not nothing. She said, no, I suppose it isn't. He looked at her with the quality he brought to conversations he was finding significant, the full attention, not performed, simply present. He said, I like talking to you. She said, yes. I've noticed I like talking to you also. He said, have you been tracking that? She said, I notice things. He said, as a practice. She said, yes. He said, what else have you noticed? She said, that you laugh in a way that is not performing laughter. He said, what does performing laughter look like? She said, it has a timing calibration. The laugh comes slightly after the moment that called for it because the calibration requires an interval. He said, and mine doesn't have the interval. She said, it doesn't. It arrives at the moment. He said, I've never thought about that. She said, I know. He said, is that good? Not thinking about it. She said, it means the laugh is real. He was quiet for a moment. He said, do you think about yours? She said, yes. He said, does it still arrive at the moment? She said, the one in the second day's workshop did. He looked at her. He said, the smile. She said, the smile. He said, I was glad it happened. She said, so was I. The closing ceremony was brief and correct. The program director's summary remarks, the completion acknowledgement for each participant, the formal photograph, the catered dinner. Vaelith attended it with the quality she brought to required functions, and with the additional quality of someone who was attending her last official event of a 2-week period, and who was aware of the last. After the ceremony, the participants dispersed to the common room in the natural way of the last evening, some in the full group's conversation, some in the smaller conversations that the 2-week proximity had produced, some in the specific private conversations of people who were in the last hours of something, and were attending to what the last hours required attending to. Cael was in the common room's east window seat, which was the seat he had occupied most evenings in the second week, because the east window faced the neutral zone's public spaces and provided the ambient activity of the market district's evening life, which he had said, on the third evening, he found more interesting than the common room's interior when the common room's interior had become familiar. He was looking at the window's view with the quality of someone who was in the last hours of the thing and was attending to the thing rather than to the last hours. She sat beside him. He said, "The market's different at night." She said, "Yes. The evening vendors are different from the morning ones. Different cultural communities use the market at different times." He said, "I didn't know that." She said, "It was in the facility's background documentation." He said, "The documentation you read that I skipped." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you've been watching the market all week with the knowledge of which communities were present at which hours." She said, "As context, yes." He said, "What's the evening community?" She said, "The neutral zone's permanent resident population, mostly. The Vaelith and Terran communities both use the market during the day for different purposes. The evening community is the people who live in the zone itself, and for whom the market is neither Vaelith nor Terran but simply the market." He said, "The people who are in the between space." She said, "Yes." He said, He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good description of what this program is trying to do. Make people who can be in the between space." She said, "The efficacy reports measure cross-cultural communication competency." He said, "Yes. But the actual thing is making people who can be in the between space. The competency is how you do it." She said, "I think you're right." He said, "Did you check whether you actually believe that?" She said, "No, I said it immediately." He said, "Good." She looked at the market through the window. She said, "I've been thinking about something you said on the 5th day." He said, "Which thing?" She said, "That the documentation is better the closer you get, but the closeness changes the observer." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about it in a different context from the one you were describing." He said, "What context?" She said, "This one." He looked at her. She said, "I came to this program with a specific understanding of what it was going to be. The efficacy metric, the functions terms. A 2-week residential program that would produce the measurable improvement in cross-cultural communication competency." He said, and she said, "And the closer I've gotten to the program's actual content, the more the observer has changed." Which is not the efficacy metric. The efficacy metric measures competency improvement. What I'm describing is something different from competency improvement. He said, "What are you describing?" She said, "I don't know exactly. I've been trying to categorize it correctly for 3 days and I don't have the right category." He said, "What does the 3-day attempt at categorization produce when you check from the inside?" She said, "That the outside categories I've been applying don't fit, and the inside evidence isn't reliable, and I am in the position of having an incomplete record rather than a false one, which you said was preferable." He said, "Yes, I did say that." She said, "I'm finding it less comfortable than I expected." He said, "Incomplete records usually are. That's why people prefer the false ones." She said, "Yes, I understand that preference better now." He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, which was the quality she had been coming to the extended conversations for, and which was in the window seat with the evening market's ambient activity and the last hours of the program around them. He said, "Can I say something that I haven't checked whether I actually believe?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I think you have a category. I think you've had it for 3 days. I think the check you're doing isn't whether the category exists, it's whether you're going to use it. She was quiet. He said, that might be wrong. She said, it's not wrong. He said, okay. She said, using the category requires something I haven't done much of. He said, what? She said, the inside evidence. Using the inside evidence as the evidence. Not as something to be verified against the outside before it counts. He said, yes. She said, I've been trained to verify. He said, I know, it's been visible. She said, it's visible. He said, not in a bad way. In the way of someone who is very good at a particular kind of checking and who is encountering a situation where the checking is the obstacle rather than the tool. She said, that's an accurate description. He said, what does the inside evidence say? Before the check, she looked at the market through the window. She looked at the evening community's activity, the people who lived in the between space, for whom the space was simply the space and not a position between two other things. She looked at the seat beside her, which was the seat she had sat in on most evenings in the second week, because the seat was where he was, and she was coming to the common room for the conversation, and the conversation was his. She said, the inside evidence says that I have spent 19 years in a preparation for a world in which everyone is always managing something, and in which I have been, for most of those years, the thing being managed, and that in 2 weeks in a seat next to yours, I have been consistently present to something that was not managed and was not managing me, and that the presence of it has been the most. She found the word with the hesitation he had described. The real hesitation of actually working something out. The most nourishing thing I've been in contact with since I can clearly remember, and that the category for that is available, and I am choosing to use it. He was very still for a moment. He said, the most nourishing thing. She said, yes. He said, I want to make sure I'm reading that correctly. She said, you're reading it correctly. He said,